Hi, my name is Derek Nord. I'm the director of the Indiana Institute on Disability and Community, Indiana's University Center for Excellence on Developmental Disabilities. I'm also an associate professor in special education. I work at Indiana University. I'm going to do a webinar today for the Rehab Research and Training Center on employment for persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I want to do this brief presentation presenting a recent study I did with colleagues Dr. Teresa Grassi and John Anderson, also from the Institute here. The study is titled Employment Equity for People with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities Across the Lifespan, the Effects of State Funding. This study can be found in the summer 2020 issue of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, Journal of the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. It's part of a special issue on employment in young adulthood for this population. So for today, I want to walk through maybe just briefly a little bit about how I'm going to approach this webinar. I'm going to start by providing a little bit of background to set the stage for why we conducted this study. Next, I'll talk a little bit briefly about the purpose and the methods that we used in this study. Of course, I'll dive into some of the key results. Not all of them, there were quite a few, but the key results specifically related to age and equity, employment equity. And then I'll just have a brief conversation about implications on policy and practices, and then we'll wrap up here. In the event you want to reach out to me after you view this webinar with any questions or comments, I'm happy to take them. My contact information will be at the very end. So first, why don't we dive into a little bit of background? I think it's really important for us in order to truly understand where we need to head, I think it's really important that we understand the context that this research is actually occurring in. And first and foremost, what we do know is that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities continue to be grossly excluded from the American labor force. When they are in the labor force, they're oftentimes unemployed, the majority of the time, in fact. So they continue to experience many, many barriers, be that discrimination, poor employment opportunities, or just poor employment fits that are not creating or leading to long-term employment. At the same time, though, we know that in the United States, there's been some major policy shifts over the last 10 or so years. There's been, I think, probably greater policy development and policy movement related specifically to employment of people with disabilities and people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to obtain and have opportunities to obtain and get work and services and supports in the community. For example, in the federal space, we have the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, which brought a lot of new changes, one of which being a key focus related to transition age and young adults, transition age youth and young adults. For example, pre-employment transition services is a good example. The purpose being to get people opportunities to learn and gain experiences that can potentially lead into greater interest and greater opportunities earlier into the workplace, and then earlier, hopefully leading to long-term over the course of a person's life. Of course, we also know that there's a number of policy initiatives going on across the country in other states. Employment First is a good example. It's been adopted, this idea that people with significant disabilities can and should have employment as a first opportunity and service expectation. That has grown across the country to the vast majority of the states across the country. Medicaid has implemented some new rules that seek to advance integrated employment, competitive integrated employment specifically for this population, for waiver recipients. So the current context both shows some challenges that we continue to face, as well as some really good opportunities. Yet we do know that our public systems continue to be stressed, they continue to be challenged, and not only in delivering quality services in a timely manner for individuals, but also they're stressed and stretched financially, where various states are having to figure out where their priorities rest, and the dollars follow priorities. So I think it's important, and really key to this study is this recognition that states differ dramatically. This is really important for us to acknowledge in how we think about employment services. Because, and I'm going to use Medicaid home and community-based service waivers here as a good example. One's experience getting a waiver or out of the waiver program varies so dramatically from state to state. The service array that's available to them, the prioritization of employment, it really depends on where you live. So really the delivery of the services that you get and the delivery of them, though you may have a waiver, really can determine very different outcomes for you if you live in a different state. And that's really important to recognize. And I think in the research sense, this was kind of core to what we were interested in, because we also know if services, that not only do services differ state to state, but so do investments, and specifically investments in employment services for this population. And it was we were theorizing or hypothesizing rather that investments matter. And if states are not investing the same amount, then that can have an effect, positively or negatively, on people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So as we dive into the purpose here, we had a couple of core research questions, and I'm going to just read them specifically here. The first was, what effect does age have on individual competitive employment outcomes among home and community-based service waiver recipients? Now, what we really wanted to understand with this question is, do young adults experience the same employment outcomes as older, as say middle age and older adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities? Is there, in other words, is there equity across the lifespan? And equity would mean that everyone is really achieving the similar outcomes across the lifespan. So that was our first question. The second was, and we hypothesized related to that question, we hypothesized that no, indeed, we do not expect younger people to have the same experiences, employment outcomes as older people. Our second research question was, does state funding commitments to integrated employment affect that inequity that we hypothesized? So does funding, so I'm going to read the question here, is the relationship between age and employment the same across states with different funding commitments? So how we approached this study then to answer those questions was, first we had to identify a couple data sources that we could leverage or utilize could get us to answer this. And the first we chose, we needed individual level data. We really need to understand the individual experience. And we opted to use the National Core Indicators 2017-2018 individual survey. Now, this survey includes a random sample from participating states. In this case, in this study, there were 33 states, a random sample of working age Medicaid waiver recipients. In total, our sample included 9,871 individuals. Now, that number, I think it's really important, that a number of people were excluded because they didn't meet the criteria, the inclusion criteria, but still, that's a very large sample and across 33 states. Next, the next data set that we used was captured from the University of Massachusetts Boston's Institute for Community Inclusion. They have the state data program that is capturing a number of key state level data points, including the state investment in day employment services, as well as the state investment in integrated employment. Those data were utilized to help us get to the funding questions and address the state funding questions that we had. Now, I'm not going to go into all of the variables that we used, but I grouped them up here, and you'll see in a later table what all of them were. our modeling procedure included, it was really important for us to be able to control for what we've found to be really important variables in understanding employment outcomes for people with disabilities. That includes a number of demographic variables related to, to race, gender, etc. Disability, the level of intellectual disability, and the we used a proxy to kind of assess severity, that being kind of the level of support a person needs. Next, we had a couple of service variables, including whether or not a person had a goal to work in the community, an employment goal to work in the community. And then we had that state level variable that we pulled from the state data, the University of Massachusetts Boston data, and that was state level fiscal effort. And just maybe a quick overview of what state level fiscal effort is. Fiscal effort is a ratio. In this case, the ratio of the number of dollars, or the amount of dollars in a state that goes to integrated employment services as a proportion of all of the funding that went to day and employment services. So I'll go into here soon in our, when I provide some early statistics, some of the descriptives of what some of those numbers were. But again, it's a ratio of the funding, of all of the funding that goes to day and employment services in the state, the ratio of those dollars that actually go to or are dedicated to integrated employment services. And then analyses-wise, we used hierarchical logistic modeling, and that's a type of modeling that allows you to account for the very different states that people come from. So it's really able to condition this model on the state, which is fantastic because we know states matter. And if states matter, then we should be controlling for that and recognizing that in our modeling. And we use something called the slope is intercept model. And I'm not going to go into too much detail here. You can read the paper for that. But what that allows us to do is to really understand the effects, the moderating effects of this state level variable, fiscal effort, on age and the outcome. Next, I'm going to dive into the results here. And first, I'm going to talk about the descriptive statistics. And this is really just a summary. And again, there's much more information in the paper, so I point you to that direction. But first, I think it's interesting because of those over 9,000 subjects that were included in this study, only 14.4% of them had a job in the community. That's a remarkably low number, and unfortunately, this is not a new statistic. It's not low now. It's been low for quite a long time. So this is something that we, I think, as a community are focused on changing. On average, people were 40 years old in this data set, and 71% were white. 57.8% were male. I have a breakout here of the level of intellectual disability from none, 7.1, to profound, 8.1. The majority of people had a mild intellectual disability of 39.1%. For the service system variables, we have 32.4% of all of the entire sample had a community employment goal, and 69% received transportation services. And level of support need, again, kind of used as a proxy for the severity of one's disability. 12.9 or 12.5% had no need for support, and that is support at home. So its level of support needed at home was how the variable was constructed. About 20% needed less than daily support. 49%, 50% required 24-hour support, so a significant level of support. And then the last point here, state fiscal effort. On average, states invested 13.8% or 0.138, so 13.8% of all of their day and employment services dollars to integrated employment. So that's a pretty low amount. That ranged from 54% to even lower than 1%. Next, I want to present this table. And again, I know it's a complex table and I'm not going to go into too much detail on it. So if you want to read more about this, again, go to the paper. Our first research question, if you recall, is does age differ, or do employment outcomes differ by age? And I think what we found here is indeed it does. And as you can see in this table, significance level and the odds ratios here, age does differ. We treated age uniquely in this study, and I say uniquely because in our field we tend to think of age as having a linear relationship with the outcome. We suspected that age had a changing effect over one's life. So we included age as a quadratic term here, allowing us to gauge a little more of the difference over the lifespan. So again, I'm not going to go into too much detail on this. I just want to make sure you had that data in front of you. Graphically, I think this is more important and maybe easier to see what those numbers related to age and the age squared, the quadratic term, the effect of age on odds of employment. So let me first, before I dive into this table, why don't I kind of set it up and show you what you're looking at. The x-axis here is age, and the y-axis here, going vertically, is the odds of employment, of having an individual job in the community. And again, the horizontal is age. And you can see age goes from 18 to 64, rather 65 is how we deemed working age. The odds go from 0.06 to 0.14, at least that axis. Now, as you can see, what this graph is really showing is it's showing that the odds of having a job in the community are the lowest for 18-year-olds, the youngest, as well as 64-year-olds. So those on the ends, the oldest and the youngest. And it's showing that the highest point is the greater odds of having, or the greatest odds for somebody to be employed, waiver recipients to be employed, was at age 42. And their odds of having employment was 1 in 7, compared to an 18-year-old, the odds being 1 in 17. Now that's a dramatic difference. That is well over 2 times worse odds for 18-year-olds. And so what this is showing us is indeed there is not equity. There is not an equal chance of having a job if you're an 18-year-old or if you're compared to a 42-year-old. Equity doesn't exist in our current waiver system. It also shows us that even at the highest point, a 42-year-old on average, having 1 in 7 odds of having an individual job in the community, those are remarkably low odds still, which tells me that we have even more, as we know, we have a lot of work to do. Even our highest, our most productive age, our most employed age is really, really still struggling to have employment in the community, individual employment. So I think that this provides a nice graphic depiction of how age affects employment outcomes. Next, we brought in state fiscal effort. Again, this is the fiscal effort going towards integrated employment as a ratio of the whole of all of the day and employment services. And I'm not going to go through this table too much, but what this shows, again, highlighted, is age and fiscal effort. Fiscal effort changes the effect of age. So recall the graph before. Age has an effect on the outcome. And what this is saying is state fiscal effort moderates that effect. Now let's look at how it moderates. So I'm going to set the stage here and describe this table or this graph, as I think it's really important and it's a bit more complex. First, you can see 3 different lines, and the lines are indicated in the legend there. The blue long dash line it denotes low fiscal effort states. The gray dotted line is the average fiscal effort state, and the black solid line is a high fiscal effort state. Now, if you look at the low and the mean, the average state fiscal effort state, the blue and the gray, the dotted and the dashed one. If you look at those curves, they look very similar to the graph before. There's not much difference. There is some difference, no doubt, but there isn't much difference. It still has that same general pattern where 18-year-olds, the oldest and the youngest, still experience greater challenges, have much lower odds than 42-year-olds, for example. However, as you can see, as greater funding goes in, as greater fiscal effort is dedicated in a state, the more those lines flatten out. So now I included the high one here, the black solid line. What that shows is a pretty flat line. It's not flat, but it's pretty flat. Flat means equity. When the odds, the flatter these lines are, the more equal the outcomes are across the age groups. And in fact here though, on average, states with high fiscal effort that invest more money, the highest amount of money, on average, 18-year-olds had the highest odds of employment, 1 in 6. That's pretty amazing. So not only do young adults have not greater equity, but they actually have higher outcomes in higher funding states. This is an important finding for this study because what it shows is the experiences of people, of young adults, and older adults in this case, but specifically I'm going to focus on young adults. The experience of young adults changes, or it is moderated. It is affected by how much money is being invested in integrated employment services in their states. Now, we can go into, why don't we dive into some of the policy or some of the implications on policy and practice. My hope is that some of them are obvious. I think in the policy, well, let's back up. First, let's just recognize that employment, even at the highest odds that we showed here, employment overall is extremely low, and we have to be able to do better than that. And we need to keep pushing, understanding, and delivering better, higher quality services, and advocating that greater opportunities exist for this population. We must do that. It's critical. But what we also found here though is experiences differ and supports may differ too. And I think that's really important. I think the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act is a really good example of how you can focus policy and practices on different age groups. And I think the pre-employment transition service is a really good example of how you can focus dollars, focus policy on really bolstering the opportunities for younger people. Now, whether or not that's playing out in these data is unknown. I can't say that, but I do think that there's some really good opportunities to test that here in the future, and it should be tested. We also know, and again, if you read the paper, you'll find all of these data in the paper. The funding commitments to integrated employment vary so much across the country from state to state. And that makes a real challenge to see the changes that we want to see, the upticks we want to see in vocation in employment services, or employment outcomes rather, for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We want to see greater upticks, but that variability makes it a big challenge. When you have states investing very, very little compared to states that are investing a very large chunk, you're going to have great disparities, as this study pointed out. And as such, that variability may come at a cost. It may come at a cost of lower employment outcomes for a lot of people. For example, those on the ends, the older and the youngest and the oldest. That may result in labor force exclusion for a lifetime. So again, I think there's a lot more to be understood related to how funding affects these outcomes, but I think this study has indicated that there is a relationship here, and it's really important for us, I think, as a field to start acting on this, or continue acting on this. And then as this showed, higher funding though, it does create greater equity, or it relates rather, it relates. This isn't a causal study. It relates to greater equity across the lifespan. So this provides us a key point of potential advocacy. I think, again, greater research to understand the causal nature of this can really continue to advance policy and help us in our advocacy efforts. So with that, I'm going to end on that. Again, I would welcome any comments, questions, reactions about this research. If you want to dialogue about it, there's my contact information. I want to thank you all for your the opportunity to present, and I hope you enjoyed it. Take care.